The Wise Fool is supported in part by an EEA grant from Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway in an effort to work together for a green, competitive, and inclusive Europe. We would also like to thank our partners Hunt Kastner in Prague, Czech Republic, and Kunstsentrene i Norge in Norway. Links to EEA grants and our partner organizations are available in the show notes. Could you please pronounce your name correctly for me?
Yes, it's Tema Stauffer.
Now, what heritage is that?
It is Eastern European. It is a place in Ghana, Africa. It's mentioned in the Bible. It means theme in Italian and Spanish. It's a lot of things, but none of them really have anything to do with me. It's just a name that my mom heard and liked. She was a teacher. One of her students was named Tema, so that's how I got the name.
Well, which lends perfectly to my next question, which is basically, tell me your background. Like, so were your parents creative? Like, how did you come to being a creative person?
My father's a retired sociology professor, and my mom, I would say she was creative. She did not have a art practice, but she was a very prolific reader, and she was very interested in arts and culture. And so my parents got me enrolled in art classes from an early age. I was always interested in art from as early as I can remember. And so at about, I don't know, even age 3 or 4, I started taking art classes at the local art center in my hometown, which is Kalamazoo, Michigan. In the beginning, I was taking ceramics and drawing and painting and so on. But yeah, I always had a passion for art, and I also played the violin. Starting at 5 years old, I played Suzuki violin, and I was a big reader. So it was, I was headed down that path from early on.
Yeah. Wow. You just reminded me, I played the violin at one point in my life, but that was just school mandated thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I mean, I liked playing the violin, but my greater passion was visual art. So sort of sometimes practicing the violin for me was more enforced, and making art was more by choice.
Well, as it all starts that
Yeah.
way. Yeah. So now these days, so I did a little research on you, of course.
Okay.
You are a teacher, you are a practicing photographer, so you make your own series of works. You are a curator, and you also do writing, but which I want to hear a little bit more about the writing also. Is that correct?
Yes, though now that I'm teaching full time at East Tennessee State University, my main focus during the past few years has been on making my photographic projects and on teaching. So I did a lot of arts writing ahead of moving down to Tennessee in 2017. I lived in New York City for 9 years, and for a good part of that time, I was doing arts writing for various publications there. I worked for an arts website called Culture Hall, and I wrote about national photo exhibitions for American Photo magazine and some other publications. And writing for American Photo carried into when I left New York to move to Montreal for my first full-time teaching position at Concordia. And then that publication ended sort of midway during my 3 years there. And so I did one article for a French Canadian arts magazine called, I'm not gonna say it right in French, but Ciel Variable or something like that. Anyway, I wrote an article about a French Canadian photographer. But that was the last assignment that I did, and I actually haven't been doing writing assignments since I moved down here. But it is definitely a part of my history.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've been a professor. I worked at a couple of different places throughout the United States before moving to the Middle East, and of course now in Prague. So, how is teaching in the United States going right now?
Well, I've been online for almost a year. Sort of the second half of my spring semester shifted to Zoom, and I've been living on Zoom, living and teaching on Zoom, for almost a year now. But it's actually going smoothly. I had thought it was going to be a harder transition than it actually has been. And, I've been happy to experience that, teaching photography classes, at least some of them online, may not be as hard as other disciplines. And, I do think the pandemic has also really fueled a lot of creativity in my students. So I felt like I saw really powerful and exceptional work in the fall that was influenced by their experiences. So it's actually been positive.
So what kind of classes, like I've taught online for like basic introductory photography and that kind of stuff, but like I feel like maybe like level 1, maybe level 2 potentially online, but when you get to higher more specialized things, I feel like there might be a lot of difficulty.
Well, I think it would be very challenging to try to like, for example, we have a color photography class here, and that in that class, students shoot on film and they scan film on our Imicon scanner. So that wouldn't be a class that we would offer right now because it's just simply impossible. But I taught intermediate photo in the fall, which is a intermediate level course, and it actually went smoothly. I mean, the main thing that's eliminated from the course obviously is printing, because the students don't have access to our visual resource center where we have our printers. I mean, they are able to go in, but I don't have the expectation that they're printing their assignments, and we view all their assignments online. But there were some actually advantages of online teaching that I felt like I discovered, that took them on 4 virtual field trips in the fall semester. And there were things that were accessible through Zoom that we might not have been able to do because of the locations where these things were taking place. For example, 2 were artist talks of artists based in Asheville, North Carolina. And one was a conversation with a documentary photographer and filmmaker, Rachel Boyo, who's in another part of Tennessee. And the other was the other one was on campus. The juror and curator of an exhibition called the Fletcher exhibit at the Reese Museum on campus. He spoke with us and gave us a virtual tour of the exhibition that he curated. So it did kind of expand possibilities as well. And that's something that was really cool to discover. And then I think I can also carry with me, even when we return to the classroom, that now we know what Zoom can offer, and even continue to bring that to the classroom.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, these times are difficult for sure, but I mean, it's still also academia. So there's certain like rubrics and standards and things that are sort of set by states, governments, whatever, that make it so you still have to meet certain criteria. They still exist, right?
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, the class is not that, it's not that dissimilar from the class that I'm teaching in classroom, aside from not printing. I mean, they have the same shooting assignments for these classes, same number of prints, same expectations in that area, but they're uploading their images to a system we have called D2L, and we're conducting these critiques online. But the content of the class, aside from, eliminating the printing component, otherwise it's essentially the same course. And I've actually felt that I also thought critiques might not be as, I don't know, somehow as substantive as they are in the classroom, but that's not really been the case. I feel like we've had some really engaging conversations. I feel like I've been able to get to know my students and connect to them. So again, it's been a largely positive experience. I mean, of course, I look forward to returning to the classroom, but it's definitely gone better than I had kind of feared it might.
Right. You had low expectations, so it exceeded that.
It exceeded my expectations a lot, actually. Yeah.
This is good. All right. Something else I noticed about you throughout your career, you seem to have gotten a lot of grants and awards and this kind of stuff. I'm always a little bit dubious, specifically of like competitions that give awards and things like this. So, like, what have been some of your experiences with the whole like entering competitions for and receiving awards?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something I consider essential part of having a professional career in the arts. You can't really do that in a sense without entering juried competitions and various opportunities for artists. And certainly you need grant support, in some cases, to launch projects and realize projects. And so I mean, for every award or grant that I've actually received, there's just so many others that I've applied for that I haven't received. And that's part of the process too. And that's actually something that I really try to bring into the classroom to my students early on. And as soon as our students are kind of at an intermediate level, let's say, I have an expectation that they start practicing applying for various opportunities for artists and showing evidence of these submissions. I did that at Concordia, and quite a number of students actually were successful in getting their work exhibited or receiving awards. And I've definitely brought that to ETSU. And also with we have a small number of graduate students here, and that's an expectation with graduate students as well as the undergraduate students. So it's part of, making your work is, maybe half of the equation, I think, of being an artist, and figuring out how do you get this work exhibited? How do you get this work funded? That's equally important.
Yes, that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Help me out. Well, what are some of the tips and what
Yeah,
are
so
some
tips, I guess it gets, first of all, the more you apply, the more opportunities you apply for, that enhances your chance of getting any of these. It's just simply, the more work you put into it, the greater likelihood of some award. It's always kind of a surprise to me, in a sense, like, I might apply for 10 things and I only get one, but because I applied for 10 things, I got that one thing. And then that one thing helps open the door to the next thing, because really you're sort of, as you build more of a CV, and you have more of a record of achieving, more of an exhibition record, or more of a record of achieving awards or receiving grants, the more that those who are looking and evaluating see the evidence that you're able to take that next step and go to another level, and you're more likely to receive the next thing more often as you build a stronger CV, certainly. And yeah, what else was I going to say about this?
Okay. Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
but wait, let's
yeah.
get into, like, the finite things because I'm from America. I was raised in the
Uh-huh.
American and taught in the American art system. However, now I live in Europe, and I see a very dramatic difference between the approach to, let's say, grants. The In America, I felt like, now maybe I misinterpreted this, but I felt like my teachers were teaching me to, like, be a cheerleader, say this work is amazing, this work is great, it should be funded, and this is why. And it was like you were writing a convincing argument to receive the grant. Whereas here in Europe, I have been speaking with many people and talking and even applying for some, and they do not want that under any circumstances. It's just, this is what I'm doing. Do you like it? Please fund it. There. And
Yeah,
so, like,
I'm not aware of that dichotomy. I do know, for one thing, in many European countries, there's a lot more government funding for artists. So, in the United States, well, I lived in Canada for 3 years, and there was, a vastly more funding from the Canadian government for artists working there. So it's just common. Many artist peers were regularly receiving grants for their work. I think it's very competitive in the United States. It's not as much money coming from the government, so the grants for artists are far and further between, and they are highly competitive. I guess as a teacher, I would say, it's not that. My primary focus as a teacher is to talk about the bodies of work that students are making, help them grow in that body of work, and give them both, constructive, positive feedback, but critical feedback as well. And really, I think, you start to, I think it's important to practice applying for opportunities. It's not the main focus for me with an undergraduate students, but I want them to be familiar with that process. The more important thing really in school, I think, is to be developing strong enough work to then, when you leave school, maybe apply to graduate school, and then, enter the art world, and then continue to figure out how to keep this work going. But yeah, I think it is important to kind of understand, even early on in education, that being an artist is a lot more than just making artwork, and that it is a profession, and it has a set of it's hard work. There are a lot of, obligations that are outside of, just the creative aspect of making the work. You have to figure out, how are you going to get this work seen, and how are you going to build a community, just extremely important. And how are you going to sort of understand the right kinds of venues and where your work fits into the art world. So those are all things that I think are important to talk about early on as well.
Certainly, all of those topics are important. But okay, you brought up the term sort of body of work. I'm fascinated with this because I also do portfolio reviews online. That's one of my many jobs that I do, and I feel that a lot of people are really bad with editing. Well, I mean, okay, they're bad with editing as far as like sequencing, choosing the right images, making them somehow visually what I call sort of cohesive. So like they don't have to like look the same, but at least they're speaking the same visual language kind of a thing that's unique in that series of work. But the thing that I know want to know is like were some of your ideas of like what makes for a good body of work?
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually something I think that comment you made about trying to make a body of work cohesive is really important. And that's also something as a teacher that I try to stress early on. So, for example, even in an introductory like digital photo one course, the students do various assignments, technical assignments in the beginning to learn the basics of, operating their camera and making exposures and understanding light and shadow and so on, like these various assignments to understand the principles of photography. But the second half of the semester, they create a final project and they actually write a short proposal, and the expectation is that it'll be a cohesive series of photographs, and they choose the theme of that final project, and then they make, say, 12 images that reflect that theme. So in my classes, I try to actually almost all the classes have a kind of final project, or for example, even my intermediate photo course, they work on a single project the entire semester, and the expectation is that it's a cohesive series of photographs. So I think that's actually important to understand that you're not just shooting images, but that you're creating a meaningful body of work reflecting whatever theme. I mean, I there's great freedom, with my students in terms of what that theme is and the style that they're shooting, etc. But I do think that that sense of cohesiveness is important to stress as a teacher.
Oh, certainly. I mean, yeah, I'm on your side. Preaching to the choir here.
Okay.
But okay, but within that, like what I find is difficult is this is like, okay, so let's say you make a body of work, 15 images, let's say. That's a good number, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The problem is like when you apply for, let's say, a grant or a residency or a competition, you can't submit all 15 because they end up saying like, oh, submit 5 or 3 or maybe even 10. But like I feel like we're encouraged to create these bodies of work, but then we're not able to submit for, funding and support and all these things, competitions, awards, whatever the complete body of work. So, like, that's a very difficult balance because, like, should we be making smaller bodies of work to fit to be able to create a beautiful submission to these things, or is work
I
more
don't think
something?
so. I don't think it's about making a smaller body of work. I mean, I think you should make the body of work however it needs to be made, and not even really with that in mind. But I think it's about being able to make an edit of a selection from that body of work of not maybe not just thinking what are the strongest images, but what are the most important images that are going to reflect what you're saying with this body of work that might be like, I need to cover these different areas of my body of work so they understand what this body of work. So for example, if there were a photo project where there were landscapes and portraits and interiors and so on, which many photo projects include these different kinds of images, that you would want to show something to reflect each of those components of the larger body of work. But I don't think it's about trying to create a body of work that fits into a certain submission criteria. And also because the submission criteria range, as you noted, from various opportunities could be usually I would say it's the smallest number maybe is 10, tends to be 10, 12, 15, maybe at the generally the most like 20 images. I mean, even when you're applying for teaching positions, for example, and you're putting together your application, generally 20 is the number of images of your work or student work. So that's just part of the process, I think, of being able to look at your own bodies of work and kind of highlight the most important images to include.
Okay. Now, in combination with that, statements. I have a long-standing issue with statements. and for that matter, even titles, because it's really hard because like we all chose to go into the visual mediums because probably we're not good writers. We feel like we can express ourselves better through photography or painting or whatever other medium we do. But yet these days we are obligated to also include some text to give context to the work, to whatever. How do you feel about that?
I think it's important. I mean, I think it's an important skill to develop as an artist, to work on your ability to articulate your motivations and the themes of your work. And I think that's, again, as a teacher, that's something that I try to implement early on, with even in the intro classes, having them write these short proposals and statements that accompany their images. Because I'm doing this in part because, exactly as you said, this is going to be an expectation throughout their career as artists, that they're able. And if you want to apply for a grant, I mean, you have to be able to talk about what is this work about and why is this important. And really, it's not convincing someone to fund it, but that it's compelling, that there's a reason, that it has clear themes or relevance, just to. So I think that it's actually, I mean, I think some artists may not be good writers, but others might be. But regardless, everyone needs to. And even those who are good writers, I think almost everyone finds it harder to write about their own work, to write these statements, than anyone else's. I've written about hundreds of other artists' work, and yet, I mean, it's gotten easier for me over time to write about my work because I've done it more and more. But I used to find it just incredibly challenging. But I think it's just practice and experience is the only way to kind of overcome that, and it is important. So, if there are blocks with that, it's just something that I think artists need to continue to work on, and also get feedback from other people. I mean, even get help. What I try to encourage students to do is try to be objective too about their work, in a way, if they can, like write about, sort of step back from the work and write about, in a way, describe the work as though you're, making somebody who can't see it be able to see it and understand it. Like, what is this about? Who is this about? Where was this taken? Just actually factual things that should be addressed and communicated as well. Sometimes I find these statements can be, too abstract, but it should be something that, if someone who's not looking at the work can read the statement, they have a clear, vision of what this project is about, in my opinion.
Okay, now, but within that, my things that I keep running into, and don't get me wrong, I'm not judging other people for this because I am as guilty of it as everybody else. So when I go to write my statements, I always fall into a realm of sort of one of two things. And often when I read statements, when I'm doing like reviews and even students' works and stuff like this, it's either way too broad and sort of like they're trying to do this universal thing that like everybody can understand, but yet nobody understands, or it's incredibly specific to the point that, well, nobody understands because it's so uniquely specific to just them and their experiences that it doesn't resonate very well. So like, how do you find, both for yourself, for your own artwork, as well as assisting students, to find that like beautiful balance of not too broad and not too specific?
Well, yeah, again, I mean, with my own projects, I guess I also, like, as I give that advice, I also try to step back and sort of break down what are the themes of this body of work. How am I going to describe that in concrete language, concrete language, and somehow also communicate, my motivations for making this body of work. And I sometimes write my statements in a third person, so it's not, all I, but that this body of work, this series addresses, examines, explores something, and then I sort of talk about the series in a way as something separate from me. Sometimes I think the part of what can actually be difficult is when it's, you think you're writing almost like about yourself, like that you have to say who you are as an artist. And I have increasingly tried to say, this is not really about me. It's about this work. It's about, and I've made different bodies of work, and they share themes. They're connected, but they're unique bodies of work. And so I'm trying to describe what the bodies of work are about, which is sort of separate than kind of expressing, in a sense, who I am as an artist, but how is this body of work communicating that?
Interesting. Okay. So when we're talking about your work now, you were also represented by, I saw three different art galleries. Is that correct?
Well, I'm currently represented by Sasha Wolf Projects in New York and in New York City and Tracy Morgan Gallery in Asheville, North Carolina. I have previously worked with a number of other galleries, but those are currently the two galleries that I'm working with. And in fact, Sasha Wolf no longer has a physical space, but she continues to represent artists in a myriad of ways.
Okay. So what the question then leads to is that you've done a number of different series of works that are different topics
Mhm.
in different formats and different things like this. When it comes to working with a gallery, like how do they love it when you just like say, you know what, I know you loved this and it sold really well, but I'm gonna do a completely different thing.
Well, definitely, whether my work is sellable or not sellable is not really an issue for me. I mean, I make my bodies of work, and there's literally no thought given in that process to whether that work would sell or not. I think it's very unpredictable which what work is going to sell and why and so on. And those are for me. I'm not saying they're not for many other artists, but for I'm not even trying to make a living in a sense from selling work. I mean, I make a living primarily as a teacher, and I'm actually more focused on funding my projects through grants and so on. So for me, it's sort of a happy surprise when an artwork sells, but that's not how I'm trying to make a living. But I'm also at a place where I do have a full-time teaching position, so that's kind of a luxury in a way to not have that pressure on my artwork to have to support me. So it happens at times, but that's not even remotely consideration to what work I make. And some of my images have been maybe in a conventional sense more or less likely to sell for the reasons that things sell. But again, that's not a consideration for me at
Wait,
all.
I'm sorry. Do you know why things sell? Because I'm not sure what that trick is.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to make big generalizations about that, but I think even we're just talking about my own work, I think there's certain pieces that, could live with people in their domestic spaces a lot easier than others. Or I don't know. It's just again, it's not really my head's not even really there in terms of like those kind of considerations about the saleability of the work. I mean, I hope for the gallerist's sake, especially that work that's exhibited will sell. And that I mean, but more importantly to me is just that work will be recognized and appreciated, and that it will be. And I mean, I mean, without getting into a lot of detail, I mean, I had a exhibit in New York that both the gallerist and I knew ahead. This is not a body of work that's going to be easy to sell, and I credit her with exhibiting that body of work anyway because she cared about it. She was willing to kind of exhibit this work, and there were other kinds of recognition that for me personally were more meaningful, which was it was reviewed in the New Yorker and other publications. And it was, a project I worked on for 5 years. And so it was, but it was work that would be, some of it sold, but it is more challenging to sell.
But that's a luxury of having a full-time teaching job for
That is a
sure.
luxury. I mean, I'm aware of that. And so I don't want, I mean, I think many artists are trying to and should be, are trying to make a living from their pieces, and that they need to maybe take kind of commercial considerations more into account. And I mean, some artists, even if they're not showing galleries, are trying to sell their work in many ways now, even through the internet, through Instagram or there's so many other ways of trying to market your work now. And so, yeah, and I'm all for artists, making a living, through their artwork. I went down a teaching path for many reasons. I mean, I love teaching, but also it's it was pretty clear to me early on that it wasn't sort of realistic to imagine just living as an artist and selling work in galleries, and that was realistic or sustainable. So, and I also didn't, I think, I lived in New York for 9 years and did a little bit of editorial work, not a lot, but a little bit, but I also realized that wasn't really the path for me either. So I continued to kind of move towards understanding that my passion is in education, and that progressively I was able to support myself as an artist through teaching, and that was a happy solution, and that I could make my work and seek funding. I still seek funding. I apply for grants every year, and that's important too, but I am more focused on seeking funding through grants than the sort of commercial aspect of selling.
I'm not judging you at all. Like, you are literally living the life that I lead, which was, going through schooling in order to be a teacher. That was my life plan, which got screwed up for various reasons, some of my own doing, some of other people's doings. But anyways, so I mean, the idea of being a sort of a practicing artist and having your full-time job so that basically you can do any project you want versus having added pressure of the sales, to having to sell, is very freeing in so many ways. Like, I mean, when I had my full time job teaching, I could literally just make whatever I wanted, and if it worked, great. Like, it made me, that sense of security that came from the job made me more free to experiment and try different things, and led me down paths that I never would have been able to achieve if I had tried to be a based marketing artist.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, academia has its own pressures. I think you're right, and that there's certain freedom about that you feel about the kind of work that you want to make. But academia also has, the pressures of, you have to perform, you have to finish projects, you have to exhibit projects, you have to, show an exhibition record and a show record of various accomplishments to keep those positions. So that was something just progressively I sort of came to understand the kind of what are the expectations of academia, and how do you sort of fit into this is the world that I'm really going to try to be in and stay in, and that's not easy. And what are those pressures? And those are the pressures I feel more heavily than I may be feel a little less pressure from the commercial art world, but I certainly feel the pressures of the academic environment.
Oh god, yes. When I was my last school, they started using, was it Scopus or something like that, for
I'm
like,
not familiar with that.
it's like, I don't know, it's some sort of like online thing that tracks academic journals, and they were trying to make us be more like active in journals, and I'm like, but I'm an artist. We don't write things, like,
Yeah.
we have exhibitions, and so my point total looked like shit because, like, I had tons of exhibitions, but none of these sort of standard university quantifiable outcomes that they come to expect.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I got a lot. I did a lot of writing for a long time ahead of entering full time teaching. So I actually do like writing and have practiced at it so long that I'm more comfortable with the expectations of writing within an academic environment. But again, I know that's something that many artists would love to not have to deal with.
Very true. Now, okay, wait. When you write, are you doing, like, art criticism?
I haven't actually published art writing in these few years that I've been in my position at East Tennessee State University. But ahead of that, the kinds of art writing I did for 4 years, I was a writer and curator for what was called an online resource for contemporary art called Culture Hall, which no longer exists. But I wrote essays about various international artists' work, and these essays they're called feature issues, and they were on the homepage, and it would revolved every couple months on the homepage, featuring different artists working, sort of making connections. The feature issues were surrounding a theme. So I would talk about 4 artists whose work reflected that specific theme. And then after that ended, I started writing for American Photo magazine, as I mentioned, and I wrote about national photo exhibitions for a feature called On the Wall. So it wasn't criticism in the sense that I actually didn't see these exhibitions. I was researching exhibitions that were going to open, or at the time that that particular issue would come out, and it was highlighting what's out there right now in the United States in photography. So I would spend hours and hours just kind of researching galleries, websites across America, and finding what the press releases and information about these upcoming exhibitions, and then I would create these kind of short paragraph, just features about what's going to be out there at the time when American Photo published that issue. So it was sort of saying, this is what's out there right now on the wall, basically. And that was really fun. And then I did a number of interviews with various photographers. And then one of the most interesting assignments I had for American Photo was when I was still living in Montreal. I went to Toronto for an exhibition called The Outsiders, about American photographers and filmmakers from, I think it was 1950 to 1980. So some of the greats like Diane Arbus and Gordon Parks and so on, and Danny Lyon and many others. And I interviewed the co-curators of that exhibition, Sophie Hackett, who's the director of photography at it's called the AGO Art Gallery of Ontario, and Jim Shedden. And that was a really exciting assignment. Very memorable to see such an incredible exhibition and to interview these two kind of brilliant minds. And then as I said, the last article that I published was for the Canadian magazine, and I met with a photographer at a gallery in Montreal, and he did black and white street photography in Montreal for decades. And we talked about his work, and then I wrote. So that was, what I really enjoyed about a lot of those writing assignments, the interviews and so on, was just, connecting to other photographers and understanding their work better, and then articulating my thoughts about it. But I do enjoy writing, and it's something I do miss a little bit, that but I have been giving so much energy to my teaching position and to my own body of work that I'm building right now. So I'd be happy to have opportunities down the road to write again. I may pursue that, but I've been very, very focused on this chapter of this is my 4th year at ETSU, and I've been developing. The first year I published my first book, Upstate, and when that ended, I began a new body of work called Southern Fiction, and that's taken up a lot of my focus and energy.
The reason why I was asking about writing was because I have this thing where I sort of believe like criticism is becoming more difficult. I don't feel like there's as much intellectual quality criticism being given, because a lot of people feel like these days, like, criticism is basically how many likes do you have on Instagram or
Right. No, it's a good point. I think that like we do live in a world now so driven and dominated by social media, and that I think people's focus is there, and that the kind of response to artwork is, as you said, likes, and that's amazing or something, but not like it's not it's very different than a serious piece of critical writing about work. Obviously, not that, of course people can post links on social media that take their audience to writing about their work, but yeah, I think there are some wonderful things about social media, and some clearly some really negative things about social media as well. I think we're all grappling with that all the time. It's kind of obliterated my attention span in some ways. It's like, you're daily consuming these like short bursts of information, And I feel like I to be able to focus on reading a book for a few hours, it's like something I know that it's my own ability to concentrate has been impacted by the experience of social media over time.
Well, not just that, but my memory is worse because I could look at something, I don't know, scrolling through Instagram, and I like, oh, that's really beautiful. And I look at it, and literally like 30 seconds later, I forgot I ever saw it
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
there's
Well,
just
there's just
such a
so
sheer
much, so much
volume.
of it
Yeah.
all the time. Yeah, of
Oh,
course. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, like, because countless, I'm always like, oh, you know what? I need to remember to show this to a friend. And like 3 days later, I won't even remember what the thing was. I'll just be like, there was something I was going to show you, but I can't remember what, like, and it was something on some social media platform somewhere. And so, like, not only is my attention span shorter, but my memory is worse
Wow.
because, like,
Yeah.
there's just so much to look at, and and of course it's not a negative thing, but like there's so much that looks very similar that it's very difficult to also to sometimes differentiate, like, oh, that came from this person, not this organization or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's a sort of inherently, kind of strange space because many of my communities in the social media spheres, which for me is Facebook and Instagram, many of them are artists, and I'm interested in seeing news about their work and snapshots, as well, and so on. But it's a space where that's mixed in with all your other connections, images of all kinds of other things and all kinds of other experiences. So it's a kind of inherently odd space of just the kind of various forms of content that coexist in this environment.
Well, then the algorithm is also feeding you
Right,
that loop of like, hey, you liked this, here's some more of it. So like you
right.
end up seeing more of what you already like. And so it's this sort of self-serving loop that you end up seeing pretty much the same thing over and over because the algorithm thinks that's what you like, which quite honestly, oftentimes, if you use it right, is what you like. So that works. Right, circling back to the topic you brought up before that I wanted to know about. So, as I said, your series of works are reasonably, I'm going to call it like disparate. Like, so, like you have like a series about this, and then a series in a completely different location, and as you said before, there's sort of a common thread between them that sort of all says it was made by you. It's of your um, morals, your ethics, your ethos, your oeuvre kind of thing. But the question is like, how do you choose the topic? So like, when you go from what, when you, especially like when you finish a series, let's say, so like you just published a book a couple years ago. So like when you're done and it's that big and you've completed that, how do you go, okay, and the next thing is going to be this?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. So I'll start saying when I finished a body of work at the end of my time in New York City, that was my Patterson series, a series of street portraits I worked on in the years following the economic crisis and that I've worked on in Patterson, New Jersey. So when I finished shooting that towards the end of my chapter in New York, and then it was exhibited a year later in New York City, but then I moved to Montreal, and then I was sort of in that it took me about a year and a half actually when that Patterson project ended, and then my new upstate body of work began, and it was I think it took a while, partly because I had transitioned to living in another country, and I initially was sort of thinking, am I going to make a new project here in Montreal? And I did actually shoot. It was not a personal project, but I did shoot a series of photographs of homeless shelters in Montreal the second summer I was there for a larger kind of collaborative project of exploring homelessness. It was called Where Do You Sleep and exhibited at City Hall. But in terms of actually making a personal project, it took me a while, and kind of realized that I've talked about this in other talks too. That I became more aware of how central, the focus about America is to all my bodies of work, and that I wasn't feeling sort of capable of making, a long-term project about. I didn't sort of connect enough to the environment. I mean, I connected in different ways. I connected with my students, I connected with the academic community, but I didn't feel that I could, that, sort of launching a long-term project there. So I was kind of grappling and struggling with that for a while. And then, but my home base while I was living in Montreal in the United States was outside of Hudson, New York. My former partner's aunt lived there. And I used to, when I would have my time away from teaching, that's where I spent most of my time. And I had immediately, even when I was living in New York City, was when I had started going up there, and that environment really had resonated with me. And it was sort of in the back of my head, I might sort of develop a project here, but I actively started it in the fall, sort of end of fall of 2015. And it did connect to me to Patterson, though it's different in some ways. There are connections as well. I mean, I'm talking about kind of post-industrial America and two very, very historic parts of, the Northeastern part of this in this country. The focus on my Patterson project was entirely on people. It's entirely in a portrait series, and that there are a few portraits in the Upstate series, but it is kind of broader about the kind of rise and fall of Hudson's economy over the, a couple hundred years, actually. And so I was really interested in that history of Hudson. So I kind of jumped in, like I said, at the end of the fall 2015, and just started. I had taken a lot of snapshots there before, but started working with my film camera. And it took a while to kind of figure out, where is this project going? And like I think most projects do, you don't really know in the beginning, and it only takes shape, or you start to understand it through the process of making it. And that's what happened in this case. And then sort of I began to try to sort of merge different important aspects of that location, specific things about the landscape and about the industrial history and about kind of social economic issues that are relevant to the area. And I mean, did a lot of exploring, just spending hours and hours and hours driving around and revisiting locations. And so I worked on that project I finished shooting it in the winter, in the December 2017, or January, very early January 2018. And I knew at that point I had connected with Daylight Books right as I was starting my teaching position in the fall of 2017, and they had asked me if I wanted to publish a book with them, and I, of course, said, I was very excited about it. I said yes, and that was launching in the fall of 2018. So I finished the project in the winter, and then spent the rest of the year working on all the many things that you need to do to prepare to realize a body of work in a book publication, as well as it was also. There were 4 solo exhibitions beginning in fall of 2018 of that body of work. So I was also producing large-scale exhibition prints of that body of work. A lot of 2018 for me was focused on the book coming out and these shows happening. But it's kind of stepping back in terms of my current body of work and the seeds of that idea, that was actually the fastest conception of any photo project I think I've ever done. In my last spring in Montreal, when I accepted the position at ETSU and knew that I was anticipating, this move to the south or the southeast, I kind of immediately had this idea. It just kind of came to me that I wanted to explore the south through the kind of framework of where the sort of great Southern writers had lived and worked during the 20th century. And it just kind of immediately, even before I left Montreal, I was already researching this. And there was a website that I found right off the bat called Southern Literary Trails, and I started researching where these writers live. So that seed was already there before I even moved to Tennessee. However, because of my focus on finishing the Upstate project and exhibiting and publishing, it wasn't until the following summer they actually started it. And the first trip that I made for that project was a trip to Milledgeville, Georgia, where I visited Flannery O'Connor's house and photographed outside her house that first time. And I've since gone back and photographed inside, though those are not included in the project. But one of the early images I shot that summer is in the project, and that's of the horse barn on Andalusia Farm, which is the estate that she lived on, sort of later part of her life, where she died and where she wrote some of her greatest work. And I've made many trips to Milledgeville and also more recently Eatonton, which is very close to Milledgeville, and that's where Alice Walker was born and raised. And so they actually were in very close proximity to one another. I mean, then I've made, maybe close to 15, 20 road trips over the course of these almost 3 years to different parts of Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama to visit a number of other writers like locales like Eudora Welty and William Faulkner and Richard Wright, and in Alabama, Harper Lee and Truman Capote, who were actually childhood friends. I grew up in this tiny town called Monroeville, and I've photographed around there as well. So,
Yeah, In Cold Blood was my first book I ever read cover to cover.
oh yeah, well it's a great one. Yeah, I can
Yeah,
appreciate that.
kind of a morbid start on reading books, but nonetheless, that was my first book.
Yeah,
But okay, wait. I want to go back a second though, because okay, so your Hudson Valley series or Hudson,
it's called
upstate,
Upstate. Yeah,
upstate.
Upstate. Yeah,
The Hudson Valley has been painted and photographed and worked on so much. So like the thing that I wonder about when I think about that is like, okay, the Hudson Valley's been documented in painting and whatever other mediums for centuries. So the question is like when you decide to do a project about a topic or a location that has been done before, how do you find the way to make it somehow special, like unique to your vision, especially when it's something that's already
yeah. Well,
been
that's a
done
good question.
before?
Yeah, I mean, so I was very conscious of the tradition of the Hudson School painters while I was working on this project. I think there's one, I actually visited Olana a number of times, and there's one particular image where I actually wanted to incorporate a view of the river that would be the same perspective in a sense that the Hudson River painters would have portrayed, to acknowledge that tradition. However, I feel like the themes of my work are actually quite different, and that style of painting is very romantic, and there's kind of an idealized, vision of this incredibly stunning landscape. It was absolutely beautiful, but that wasn't the focus of my work. Was like the beauty. I mean, I incorporate some of that beauty in the images, but the things that I'm photographing, like the factories and the Fergery shacks, for example, I mean, that's quite different, I think, than the focus of these landscape painters.
Okay, so you sort of take on the history of it and sort of utilize it in some way, but
Yeah,
then
I wanted to
add to it.
acknowledge it and honor it and understand that this is a beautiful region, and that it has been beautifully portrayed by other artists. But I'm trying to kind of even acknowledge that in the body of work, but it's also so very different. I think what like the focus is on the Upstate series of photographs.
All right. And that now, what that starts making me think about is how many photos do you take to make an essay? Because like done everything. I used to shoot 4x5, so like when I would go out, I literally only had 24 shots because that's all the film holders I had. And then of course I've transitioned to doing digital where I just shoot hundreds and hundreds of photos because well fuck it, they're free. Why not?
Yeah.
Versus buying film and putting the time in and the money for the
Right.
film development, all that. So so I'm wondering sort of like, what's your practice? Like, so do you shoot a lot? Like, I mean, are you talking thousands?
Okay, so I'm entirely shooting film, and I'm like, why am I doing this? Because it's so much, in a sense, extra work and money. And sometimes I just also want to say fuck it and just shoot digital. But right now, I mean, I'm making this project on film, and I'm going to finish this project on film, and then, we'll see in the long term. But I do love film, and but also with the Hudson, with the Upstate series, I thought it was important. Well, both projects are so much about history, and I feel like I wanted to use what I think is a kind of more historical, approach, and shoot with. I'm shooting with 4x5, and yeah, some of the upstate was medium format film, and about half of it is medium format and half of it's 4x5. And this project, the Southern Fiction Project, is entirely 4x5. And I do shoot a lot, actually, and it gets really expensive. And I'm shooting, for every one 4x5 image, there's 20 or 30 or more that don't make, or more even, that don't make the final cut. That is a lot. With and also with shooting 4x5, there it's a lot easier to make mistakes, for things to go wrong. I've had, light leaks, and just one thing after another, so there's a lot of extra frustrations. But there's also something for me that's extremely rewarding about the process that I really love. And I think it does, there is a certain investment in making that one image, and the experience of making that image with a 4x5, that for me is quite different than if I were to just to shoot digitally, and to shoot, hundreds of pictures, and not feel, I can feel like, well, a little more casual about it in a way. And I think I wanted to feel that kind of really hard work and investment and sort of precision and focus to make each of these image, both for the experience of that, but also for the final presentation of that, to make these large scale prints that have the kind of, richness and detail and depth that you can accomplish. And not to say that you can't get many of those things from digital, especially, the higher end, medium format digital cameras, I think, are great too. But I don't have one, but it may be something in my future. I'm not entirely opposed. I'm thinking about it, but I have been committed to film throughout my entire, couple decades of making work.
Get a grant from the school to buy one.
Right.
That's what I would do.
Yeah, it's not for me that I couldn't figure out how to buy one. It's just that I'm not ready to do it yet. But I'm not. I might be at some point. I do. I do love shooting for. But even, I came back from a trip in the fall and ruined a bunch of 4x5 film that there. I think, it was a light leak, and I had to return to Mississippi to reshoot something I just, reshot. I photographed in November, and I went down there again. I was just like, wow, like, if I were shooting this digitally, I know right off the bat, that I got this, what it looks like. It's not all this. I mean, some of the mystery of getting your 4x5 film back is very exciting, and I love that too. But sometimes I just feel like, why do I make things so hard on myself? And I just, see what I got, and that's it. And I come home, and, so there's, there are advantages of both approaches, or there are things I'm attracted to about both approaches right now. But I'm certainly going to finish the Southern Fiction Project on film, because, it's almost done at this point, and I've shot the entire thing on film. So it's, you know,
In no way, shape, or form am I trying to encourage you to go digital. Like, I love analog. I still shoot Polaroid if I can get it. Like, I mean, so like I'm all for it. So, but it's just an interesting difference that I noticed when I was shooting film. You're much more thoughtful because you go, okay, I only have 36 shots on this, or 12 shots,
or
or I've only
one
got
if you're shooting
yeah,
4x5.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Or I've only got 12
yeah,
holders with me,
yeah,
kind of thing. And so like you're much more thoughtful and precise, and you're more patient,
yeah.
with the light and the little nuanced things that can be shot. Digital, like when you shoot it, you're like, oh, you know what? I can just fix that in post production, or
Right, right, right.
whatever.
Yeah,
And
so
like,
that's exactly what I mean. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And so I mean, that's, we're making a big generalization. I'm sure there's a lot of, people shooting digitally who are very invested in that single image, and spend a lot of time with that. But I do think there's something, especially about shooting large format, that just the time and patience it takes to set up and get everything in focus. I mean, you really have to kind of commit and make a lot of decisions for that single photograph. And I do like that. I do value that.
I know. I wish I had my 4x5, but I don't have it anymore. But I never actually owned one, now that I think about it. I had one for 10 years, but that's because somebody lent it to me and never asked for it back. So, and then when I moved out of the country, I was like, I should give it back to them. No, yeah, it'd be rude for me to leave the country with a borrowed camera. You mentioned daylight books. I'm always fascinated, of course, as almost every artist and or photographer is fascinated. Like, how does one connect with a book publisher and then get a book published?
Right, really important question too. So in this case, what happened is I had submitted images to one of their opportunities. I can't remember exactly what the name of it is right now, but it's a way that they choose to either exhibit or publish photographers through this opportunity, but it's also a way for them to look at other photographers' work. And that's how they had seen the images from the Upstate series, but they actually reached out to me, Michael, who's the kind of like the director of Daylight Books, Michael Ikoff. He just sent me an email and said, "Would you be interested in talking about publishing a book?" And I got that email just a week ahead of starting my fall semester, and then I reached out to some trusted friends who had published with them ahead and spoke with them about their experiences. And then over the course of the next month, Michael and I negotiated the contract and figure out the details of the book. And yeah, and then it was actually extremely positive experience working with Daylight. But in how other people do it, I mean, that was my experience. But I mean, I have friends and peers who either they've been approached or they are submitting. I mean, almost, I think many of these book publishing companies, even on their websites, have instructions about how do you submit a book proposal to be evaluated. And I know, I mean, I definitely know friends and peers who have had books published that way too. So I think there are many paths that can lead to a book publication.
All right. Two last questions.
Sure.
First one's a little hard, second one's easier.
Okay.
Could you give me the names of 3 artists that you think should be seen by more people?
Sure. Yeah. So, well, for example, one artist that I'll mention is a friend and former colleague whose name is Yolanda Delamo, and she's originally from Madrid, lives in New York City, and she is publishing her first book in this next year with Kara Verlag, a German publishing company, and it's more than a decade of her work, which are kind of a hybrid of, I mean, staged photography, it's portraiture. There's some documentary element to it, but it's very strong, conceptually strong work, and very sort of. This is also large form work, very precise and sort of beautifully lit and very compelling. She's sort of looking at the relationships between people who are performing characters and looking at the kind of spaces between people. So it's a lot about distance between people share occupying a space, and you create narratives surrounding each image. Another artist who I think's worth mentioning is also a friend and lives in Asheville part of the time and teaches photography at Rollins College, and just had a exhibition this fall at Tracy Morgan Gallery. So we share the same gallery, and she just had a beautiful exhibition of it's not at all, there's no sort of documentary aspect to her work. It's more use of alternative process and cyanotype and video. The body of work is about grief and mourning and a lot of her own kind of past experiences. And there's a metaphor of a yew tree and some literary references she spoke about in her artist talk. That was actually one of the virtual talks that I brought my ETSU students to.
What was her name?
Oh, Dawn Rowe. I'm sorry. Dawn Rowe. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And do you have a third person?
Let me get back to that.
It's fine, no problem.
Okay.
I'll go on to the last question that I
Okay.
ask
Yeah.
everybody, which is just general advice. So anything's like specifically what I'm looking for is something that you went through that you hope that the next generation doesn't have to go through. Something you learned that you hope they don't have to deal with.
This generation right now is dealing with something way harder than I ever had to deal with before this year. So actually, I really feel for everybody, but young people, young artists who are the way that the pandemic has made their, compromise their education or made it so much more challenging, but then having to kind of enter the world professionally at a time like this where, it's so hard already to be an emerging artist and to try to get your first teaching positions or to try to get your first exhibitions. I mean, it's just years and years and years of obstacles and persistence and kind of brushing off the dust and keep going. And so for that to be made all the harder now by the pandemic, I feel like, obviously my trajectory in the arts was full of struggle throughout, and it still is, but I'm going to say that, just the world I was living in was easier than it is in the past year. Even if it was hard. There are obviously many very difficult things happening in the country and world, throughout these past couple of decades too, but nothing like this. So I'm going to say that these younger artists have a major challenge, and but also, as I was saying kind of early on, that I felt like my students responded to some of the challenge and suffering and struggle of the pandemic with it really fueled great work. So if that's one good thing that can come out of this, is that it actually, well, I mean, I think even historically, like political struggles, social struggles about race, gender, and sexuality, those are also, that is an inspiration, I think, for artists too, and some of the best work comes out of this. So these kind of challenges.
Oh yeah, I've had many conversations where it's basically like, while the pandemic is horrible, I don't want to downplay that at all. In the creative industries, limitations often breed creativity, and so like the different whatever, financial limitations, space because of quarantines and things like this will often breed some very interesting outcomes from what we deal with and how we figure out how to work within that.
I agree. I definitely think so. Yeah, and so that's one good thing that we can take from a lot of very difficult experiences that we've all collectively had.
Indeed. Did you come up with a third person?
Let's see. Person.
It's okay. Don't worry about it.
I,
It's not a necessary thing. It's just a question.
I don't think I can do it on the spot. Maybe you can just ask that question. Can you think of two artists and then edit it to the two artists that I mentioned? Or does it have to be three to keep consistent?
No, it doesn't have to be anything. Don't worry. I'm gonna leave the whole conversation and it'll be fine. It's perfect. Like the last person I asked for 3, he only gave me 2. So,
Okay.
yeah, don't worry about it. Like,
Okay.
it's perfectly fine that I only get 2. It's just that I like the number 3. That's it. So that's why I asked for 3. All right. Well, thank you very much for your
Well,
time.
thank you. Yeah, that was fun. And I look forward to, staying in touch about it. So thanks a lot.